Since you've worked in one sector for one company throughout your entire career, getting a sense of your worldview is incredibly important, since you will be the chief advocate and advisor to the President-elect on those issues. So I'd like to go through a series of questions. I think many of them can be answered by a simple yes or no. Others will probably take a greater, more extensive answer. So, and you've alluded to some of this in your opening statement, so let me go through several of them. Do you believe it is in the national interest of the United States to continue to support international laws and norms that were established after World War II?
Yes, sir.
Do you believe that the international order includes respecting the territorial integrity of sovereign countries and the inviolability of their borders?
Yes, sir.
Did Russia violate this international order when it forcefully annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine?
Yes, it did.
Did Russia's continuing occupation of foreign countries violate international laws and norms?
I'm not sure which specific countries you're referring to.
Well, the annexation of Crimea, the
Yes,
eastern Ukraine, Georgia, just to mention a few.
Yes, sir.
Does Russia and Syria's targeted bombing campaign in Aleppo, on hospitals, for example, violate this international order?
Yes, that is not acceptable behavior.
Do you believe these actions constitute war crimes?
Again, Senator, I don't have sufficient information to make that type of a serious conclusion. Coming to that conclusion is going to require me to have additional
Do you understand what
the
standard is for a war?
I do.
And knowing that standard and knowing what is all within the realm of public information, you cannot say whether those actions constitute a war crime or not.
I would not want to rely solely upon what has been reported in the public realm. I would want confirmation from agencies who would be able to present me with indisputable facts.
For all the
Senator Menendez, if I could, let me ask a little bit.
If you won't take my time, Mr.
No, I'm not taking your time. It'll be added back. If you had sufficient evidence, though, in looking at classified information that had taken place, would that not be a war crime?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
For all of these answers that you've given me, does the President-elect agree with you?
The President-elect and I have not had the opportunity to discuss this specific issue or the specific area.
Well, in your statement on page 3, you say, in his campaign, President-elect Trump proposed a bold new commitment to advancing American interests in our foreign policy. I hope to explain what this approach means and how it implement that policy if I am confirmed as Secretary of State. So I assume to some degree that you've had some discussion about what it is that worldview is going to be in order to understand whether you're willing to execute that on behalf of the person you're going to work for.
In a broad construct and in terms of the principles that are going to guide that, yes, sir.
And I would have thought that Russia would be at the very top of that, considering all the actions that are taking place. Did not happen?
That has not occurred yet, Senator.
It's pretty amazing. You built a career on Exxon Mobil that you said afforded you the opportunity to engage regularly with world leaders, including Vladimir Putin in Russia. In 2013, he awarded you with the Order of Friendship Award. And in our conversations, you told me you had direct and personal access to the Russian president over the course of your tenure there. Then in 2014, ExxonMobil lobbied aggressively against sanctions on Russia after their invasion of Ukraine. Exxon lobbied against the Stability and Democracy for Ukraine Act, which I introduced in the Senate last year. You employed well-known Washington-based lobbyists to support these efforts. You personally visited the White House and reported that you were engaged, quote, at the highest levels of government. In essence, Exxon became the in-house lobbyist for Russia against these sanctions. Sanctions are one of the most effective diplomatic tools in our arsenal, one we rely on to avoid putting American lives at risk by engaging in traditional kinetic warfare. Now today, in response to a previous question by Senator Cardin, you said sanctions are a powerful tool. But you have made statements and given speeches where you have said you do not believe sanctions are a useful tool. So if sanctions are not a useful tool, have you changed your view? What are the tools of peaceful diplomacy you will use to get countries to return and act within the international order? What are you going to say to Vladimir Putin when he says to you, but Rex, you said sanctions were bad?
Senator, I think it's important to acknowledge that when sanctions are imposed, they by their design are going to harm American business. That's the idea, is to disrupt America's business engagement in whatever country is being targeted for sanctions. And so broadly,
I don't think it's to disrupt American business. I think it's to disrupt the economies of those countries. Now, American business may or may not be affected to some degree.
American business, if America is going to have an influence on disrupting those economies, then the intent behind the sanctions is to disrupt that country's access to American business investment, money flows, technology, and all the know-how.
Financial sectors.
Correct.
Or financial sectors.
So by its very, and I'm only stating a fact, I'm not debating it, but the fact is sanctions, in order to be implemented, do impact American business interest. In protecting America's interest, and I think this is where the President-elect would see the argument as well, is sanctions are a powerful tool. Let's design them well, let's target them well, and then let's enforce them fully. And to the extent we can, if we can have other countries join us, or if we are designing sanctions in concert, let's ensure those sanctions apply equally everywhere. So
Well,
as U.S. interest
when
is
you
not,
made your remarks, and I have a long list here, which I'll introduce for the record, you did not differentiate that way. You basically made the broad case that sanctions are not an effective tool. Now, I heard your response now, but in your opening statement, you said that, quote, America must continue to display a commitment to personal liberty, human dignity, principled action in our foreign policy, and that we are the only global superpower with the means and moral compass capable of shaping the world for good. I totally agree with you in that respect. But, Mr. Tillerson, our efforts in leading the international community, for example, on sanctions against our adversaries like Iran and North Korea, represent exactly that, leadership and a moral compass. It's not about disadvantaging American businesses. It's about putting patriotism over profit. Diplomacy is not the same as deal-making. Diplomacy requires getting other countries often to do things they may not always want to do, and there isn't necessarily something to trade for it for. This is how we were able to build an extensive and effective sanctions network against Iran, through legislation from Congress and diplomatic pressure from secretaries of state across different administrations. We were able to build the framework of primary and secondary actions that ultimately crippled Iran's economy. Now, you lobbied against the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, which I was the author of. You reportedly, under ExxonMobil, and I say you, ExxonMobil, but you were the head of ExxonMobil, wanted to eliminate secondary sanctions that would prevent joint ventures. This makes sense, as in 2003, and 2004, and 2005, you were engaged through a subsidiary company in businesses with countries who the United States listed as state sponsors of terrorism, including Iran, Syria, and the Sudan. Countries that, except for the maneuver of your subsidiary, ExxonMobil could not have been dealing with. ExxonMobil is listed as a coalition member of USA Engage, an advocacy group that lobbies against sanctions. This group also lobbied against sanctions, including against Iran, and applauded passage of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So my question is, with that as a history, with the work that you did in the spring of 2011, where you oversaw an ExxonMobil deal with the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, after the United States government expressly did not want to see that happen, fearing that a deal would undermine the U.S. policy of one Iraq and lead the country closer to civil war. What message are you now going to be able to send to American businesses who are intent on pursuing their own interests at the expense of U.S. policies and potential political stability in foreign countries? How are you going to recalibrate your priorities as Secretary of State? Your shareholders are the American people and their security and their interests.
well, there was a lot in that question, Senator.
I'll give you the rest of my time.
Around which I could respond. First, I have never lobbied against sanctions, personally. I continue to believe
The
sanctions.
company you directed did.
To my knowledge, Exxon never directly lobbied against sanctions, not to my knowledge. In terms of all the other actions that were mentioned there, they've been done with. They were all undertaken with a great deal of transparency and openness, and engagement and input to the process. That's the beauty of the American process, is that others are invited to express their view and inform the process. But my pivot now, if confirmed to be Secretary of State, will have one mission only, and that is to represent the interest of the American people. And as I've stated multiple times, sanctions are an important and powerful tool. But designing poor sanctions and having poor and ineffective sanctions can have a worse effect than having no sanctions at all if they convey a weak response. So it's important in designing sanctions that, as I've said, that they're carefully crafted, they're carefully targeted with an intended effect, and then enforced. And to the extent American leadership then can broaden participation in those sanctions, and you're exactly right, the Iran sanctions were extraordinarily effective because others joined in.
Thank you. Senator Menendez has played an incredible role for our nation, making sure that sanctions are in place, and has led us all, if you will, relative to Iran.